So for the first material is about the meaning of plot. Plot, also known as storylines. It is the sequence of events where each affects the next one through the principles of cause and effects in literary work, film, story, or other narratives. In short, a plot is how the story is going to develop, unfolds, and moves in time. Or we can say that plot is the structure or organization of events that make up a fictional story. From definition above, we can conclude that plot is the main point in a literary work because it will determine how the story unfolds and how interesting it is. Then, we move to the elements of plot. Plots are typically made up of 5 main elements. The first one is exposition. It is the part where the characters, setting, and the main conflict are introduced, and usually occurs at the beginning of the story. In this part, we get to know who is who, as well as when and where the story takes place. At this point, the reader is just getting to know the world of the story and what it's going to be all about. Then, raising action. It is where the main characters start to face some problems and events leading up to facing the conflict begin to unfold, and the story becomes complicated. For example, in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, the raising action would be when we learn who Voldemort is and lots of bad things start happening, which the characters eventually realize are all connected to Voldemort. Then, the third one is climax. Climax is the peak of the story. A big event occurs in which the main characters face an enemy, fear, challenge, or other sources of conflict. The most action, drama, change, and excitement occurs here. For the example, in classical tales of heroes, the climax would be when the hero finally faces the big monster, and the reader is left to wonder who will win and what this outcome could mean for the other characters and the world as a whole within the story. Then, falling action. It is where the story begins to slow down and work towards its end, tying up loose ends. In this part, we start to see the results of the climax and the main character's action, and get a sense of what this means for them and the world they inhabit. And for the last is resolution, or also known as the denouement. It is a concluding paragraph that resolves any remaining issues and ends the story.
Okay, now we are moved to the types of plot. So, the plot of a story is a series of interconnected events in which every occurrence has a specific purpose. Jadi, dari setiap plot itu memiliki tujuan tertentu. Baik itu bisa untuk menunjukkan hubungan, atau menyarankan penyebab, atau membangun koneksi. Supaya pembaca itu tadi paham tentang apa yang diceritakan di dalam cerita atau literatur tersebut. Okay, now we are moved to the 4 types of plot structure. The first one is dramatic of progressive plot. After we learn about the elements of plot, ada 5 elemen dari plot. Okay, this plot is a chronological structure which first establishes the setting and conflict, then follows the rising action through a climax, and concludes with a denouement and wrapping up a loose end. So, this first type, a dramatic or progressive plot, is secara beruntutan dari setting konflik, lalu ada rising action, kemudian klimaks dari rising action tadi diakhiri dengan penyelesaian masalah, kemudian berakhir. So, this is a chronological structure through the 5 elements of plot. And the second one is an episodic plot. This is also a chronological structure, but it consists of a series of loosely related incidents, usually of chapter length, tied together by a common theme and or characters. So, di types yang kedua ini sebenarnya sama seperti yang types pertama, yakni sama-sama chronological structure secara kronologis. Hanya saja bedanya setelah klimaks itu ada muncul masalah lagi. Setelah klimaks, ending, lalu muncul masalah lagi, dan terulangnya seperti itu. And usually this type is used when the writer wishes to explore the personalities of the characters, the nature of their existence, and the flavor of an era. Jadi, plot ini digunakan ketika penulis ingin mengeksplorasi kepribadian karakter, sifat keberadaan mereka, dan juga cita rasa sebuah zaman, sehingga cenderung akan lebih panjang ceritanya. And the third is a parallel plot. The reader weaves two or more dramatic plots that are usually linked by a common character and a similar theme. Okay, so in the third types of plot structure, plot parallel is writer want to weaves two or more dramatic plots. So, penulis itu menyusun dua atau lebih plot dramatis yang biasanya dihubungkan oleh karakter yang sama dan tema yang serupa. Okay, the fourth is a flashback. The structure conveys information about events that occurred earlier. It permits author to begin the story in the midst of action but later fill in the background for full understanding of present events. Flashback can occur more than once and different part of story. As we know that plot flashback itu biasanya berguna untuk memberikan kejelasan tentang cerita yang digambarkan oleh penulis. So usually the writer will tell about the past events to explain more about the present events. Beside that, guys, between the fourth type of plot structure, we get references that there are many types of plot in the world, but realistically, most of them fit some pattern that we can see in more than one story. For example, the types of plot for the first is overcoming the monster. Overcoming the monster when the protagonist must defeat a monster or force in order to save some people or usually everybody. For example, in the novel of Harry Potter and Beowulf. And the second is rags to riches. This story can begin with the protagonist being poor or rich, but at some point the protagonist will have everything, lose everything, and then gain it all back by the end of the story. For example is Cinderella. So the protagonist akan menjadi seorang yang kaya atau miskin terlebih dahulu, tetapi kemudian mereka akan mendapatkan segalanya. And the third type is the quest. It is when the protagonist embarks on a quest involving travel and dangerous adventures in order to find treasure or solve a huge problem. So for the example, we know this type of plot in the story or novel The Lord of the Rings. And then the voyage and return. The protagonist goes on a journey to a strange or unknown place, facing danger and adventures along the way, but after that returning home with experience and understanding. So pada types plot yang ini, yaitu ketika protagonis itu tadi bukan menyelesaikan sebuah misi, tetapi seperti adventures sepanjang waktu, kemudian kembali dengan banyak pengalaman. For example, is in Alice in Wonderland, The Chronicles of Narnia. And the next is comedy. A happy and fun characters find a happy ending after triumphing over difficulties and adversities. Ya, seperti pada plot pada umumnya, cerita komedi ini menceritakan tentang karakter yang bersifat lucu dan kemudian diakhiri dengan happy ending. For example, is in Fantastic Mr. Fox and Home Alone. And the next is tragedy. Tragedy is when the protagonist experiences of conflict which leads to very bad ending, typically death. For example, is Romeo and Juliet, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and Macbeth. So, pada plot tragedi ini biasanya bad ending or typically death. And the next is rebirth. The protagonist is a villain who becomes a good person through the experience of the story's conflict. Rebirth ini biasanya orang yang jahat kemudian setelah mengalami pengalaman tertentu pada konflik story-nya itu menjadi seorang yang good person. For example, The Secret Garden, A Christmas Carol, and The Grinch. So, from these 7 examples, so many stories follow a common pattern. In fact, according to many thinkers, such as the great novelist named Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Campbell, there are only a few basic patterns which are mixed and combined to form all stories. Jadi, untuk yang ketujuh tipe plot yang saya jelaskan tadi itu merupakan salah satu pattern plot yang banyak digunakan oleh penulis-penulis saat ini.
The plot is what makes a story a story. It gives the story character development, suspense, energy, and emotional release, or also known as catharsis. It allows an author to develop themes and, most importantly, conflict that makes a story emotionally engaging. Everybody knows how hard it is to stop watching a movie before the conflict is resolved.
In the fourth is examples of plot in literature. Example 1. Caitlin wants to buy a puppy. She goes to the pawn and begins looking through the cage for her future pet. At the end of the hallway, she sees a small, sweet brown dog with a white spot on its nose. At that instant, she knows she wants to adopt him. After he receives shots and a medical check, she and the dog, Berkeley, go home together. In this example, the exposition introduces us to Caitlin and her conflict. She wants a puppy but doesn't have one. The rising action occurs as she enters the pawn and begins looking. The climax is when she sees the dog of her dreams and decides to adopt him. The wailing action consists of a quick medical check before the resolution or ending when Caitlin and Berkeley happily head home. So in this, we can talking conclusion that Caitlin feel happiness with the both pet. The second is example 2. Scott wants to be on the football team, but his worth and wants make the team. He spends weeks working out as hard as possible, preparing for tryouts. At tryouts, he amazed coach with his skills as a quarterback. They asked him to be their starting quarterback that year and give him a jersey. Scott leaves the field ecstatic. They explain first, the exposition introduces Scott and his conflict. He wants to be on the team, but he doubts his ability to make it. And the second, the rising action consists of his training and tryout. The climax occurs when the coach tells him he's been chosen to be quarterback. And the third, the wailing action is when Scott takes a jersey and their resolution is him leaving to try out as a happy quarterback. So we can take the conclusion that Scott has been successfully with his endeavor. Each of these stories has an exposition as characters and conflicts are introduced. A rising action which brings the character to the climax as conflicts are developed and faced, and a wailing action and resolution as the story concludes.
Okay, next we're going to talk about how to write a plot. Making your own plot might sound difficult, but it's not. In order to write a plot, the first step you have to do is think of a main idea, character, or situation. And the second step is
think about how it might develop. Then the last step is apply the 5 elements of plot. You can turn anything into a story. For example, think of a time you were hungry. This would be the conflict in a situation. For example, the situation is I was hungry, and then we construct the 5 elements of plot. The first is exposition. I was hungry, so I went into the kitchen to search for something to eat. The second is rising action. I had to figure out what food in the fridge had gone bad wasn't being saved by someone, and then figure out how to cook it. The third is climax. I cooked and ate it. The fourth is falling action. The meal made me sleepy. The last is resolution. I went to take a nap. After construct the 5 elements of plot, you can combine them and your short story is ready. I was hungry, so I went into the kitchen to search for something to eat. I had to figure out what food in the fridge had gone bad, wasn't being saved by someone, and then figure out how to cook it. I cooked and ate it. The meal made me sleepy. I went to take a nap. As is shown in this example, a short story can be easily created by using the 5 elements of a plot. The next is when to use plot. Although plot is mainly an element of storytelling, even the organization of a formal essay can often be seen as a kind of plot. Usually, in formal essays, the author introduces a topic and a question or hypothesis or the conflict, and then the paper goes on a journey through various ideas in order to finally resolve the question or prove the thesis or the climax and concludes. It may be fun or useful to think of formal essays in terms of plots, but keep in mind that formal essays are not stories and should contain no fictional elements. On the other hand, plot should not be used in technical papers and manuals, which do not tell stories but instead inform and instruct.